What's up guys, Saf here on SuperSaf TV and welcome to the SuperSaf style camera comparison between the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra and the iPhone 14 Pro Max. As always, we'll be testing out all aspects of the cameras, front facing, rear facing, images, video, low light, portraits, all of it. There will be some timestamps down below if you are interested in a particular section, but you're going to want to see all of it. So we're going to kick off with some images from the primary camera. Now, after taking hundreds of photos, there's a few things you'll notice. Generally speaking, both take excellent images from the primary camera. You've got excellent dynamic range, however, they do handle colors slightly differently. As always, Samsung devices tend to have a bit more of a saturated look, but you can get a similar look on the iPhone if you use photographic styles. Now, I generally tend to leave this as standard, but if you are somebody who prefers more of a saturated, vibrant look, you can do that on the iPhone as well. One thing we do have to touch on is Samsung's new 200 megapixel sensor. Now, generally speaking, you will be shooting at around 12 megapixels. This is going to use pixel binning, so it's going to combine 16 pixels into one. But if you'd like, you can switch to either 50 megapixels or get that full 200 megapixel resolution. Now, on the iPhone, you do have a maximum of 48 megapixels. And when we do go in 100%, you can get so much more detail on the S23 Ultra. Look at all those scratch marks on this endoskeleton. All of that detail has been maintained really well. Now for low light, it was actually really close overall. I think both of these devices take great shots in low light. This image is really close, although I would lean slightly towards the S23 Ultra. Some of the highlight details have been maintained better. And in this example, it's quite interesting because the S23 Ultra has maintained more of the shadow details on the fence, but where the light is on, the iPhone 14 Pro Max has maintained that a little bit better. Now, one thing that I did notice consistently is in comparison to the S23 Ultra, the iPhone in low light doesn't use as much of a long shutter speed, so it takes low light images quicker, which does result in generally darker images. Now, you can manually go in and extend that shutter speed if you'd like to do so, but I did leave things at default. Now, in this example, which is indoor low light, I do prefer the S23 Ultra. Not only is it a brighter image, but it is also sharper and it has less noise. Now, one thing we do have to talk about is shutter lag. Now, this is something that a lot of you guys have asked me to cover in previous videos. And when you are trying to capture fast moving subjects, you can see here in this test, I've been moving this object up and down while taking shots consistently. And as you can see, there is a noticeable shutter lag on the S23 Ultra compared to the iPhone 14 Pro Max. And this results in more overall blurry images on the S23 Ultra. So what does that mean? Well, if you have kids or pets who never stay still, then you are going to be getting more shots in focus on the iPhone 14 Pro Max compared to the S23 Ultra. And I know that's very important to a lot of people. Now let's look at flash photography. Now, I tend not to use the flash unless it's really needed in particular situations. And in this situation, I think both are actually doing really well. You can see that we've got even exposure. And also here, I would say things are pretty even. Although the iPhone does seem to have maintained the colors better. If you look at the black of my top and my jacket and jeans, there is more of a blue tint on the S23 Ultra compared to the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Now, just a quick reminder before we continue, if you're enjoying this video so far and you want to see more like it, then do consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon if you haven't already. I'm also working on a detailed side-by-side comparison between the iPhone 14 Pro Max and the S23 Ultra, looking at all of the other features as well as the cameras. So that's going to be coming very soon and you don't want to miss it. Right, now let's look at the ultra-wide cameras. Both devices have excellent ultra-wide cameras and they do a great job overall. However, I did notice that the S23 Ultra does have better dynamic range from the ultra-wide camera. There's slightly better shadow details in this image, but in this image in particular, you can see that the iPhone 14 Pro Max has clipped the highlights in the background, whereas the S23 Ultra has not. Now, both ultra-wide cameras do have autofocus, which means you can focus in close for macro shots, and I think both do an excellent job overall. In this example, the iPhone has gone for a bit more of a contrasty look, but I think generally speaking, for macro photography, both of these are very close. Right, now low light with the ultra-wide camera, I think both are actually doing a very good job. There seems to be a tad more detail in the building on the iPhone compared to the S23 Ultra. But in this example, I do prefer the S23 Ultra. You've got sharper overall details, and again, in those highlight areas, the S23 Ultra has done a better job. So for the ultra wide camera overall, my preference is the S23 Ultra. Right, now let's look at zoom. So the iPhone has a single zoom camera. The S23 Ultra has two zoom cameras. One is around 3 times and the other is 10 times, which uses periscope zoom technology. So if we are at 3 times, the first thing you'll notice is that there is a difference in focal length, even though both are technically 3 times. And that's because the S23 Ultra has around 70mm for the 3 times optical zoom lens, and the iPhone has around 77mm. And this is something that you'll notice consistently across this video. Now, when we do go to 10 times zoom, this is where the periscope zoom camera kicks in on the S23 Ultra, and you can see that we've got a much cleaner image compared to the iPhone 14 Pro Max. The iPhone 14 Pro Max, considering this is digital zoom, isn't doing too bad. You can almost read some of the text that I'm holding up, but it's just not as sharp as the S23 Ultra. Now, the iPhone 14 Pro Max maxes out at 15 times. Maxes out. And if we compare this to the S23 Ultra at 15 times, you do get a much cleaner image. Now, the S23 Ultra can extend to 30 times, which is usually the max that I use it at. And here you can see that we can clearly read the text. And this is something that's really useful if you do need to zoom into a sign in the distance. The S23 Ultra also extends all the way to 100 times. Now, I personally don't use this too much. You can use this to take pictures of the moon, but in this example, you can see that if there is something that you really want to zoom in on, you can do that and you can read this text, which you wouldn't have been able to do on the iPhone. So yes, when it comes to extended zoom, the S23 Ultra having that dedicated periscope zoom camera does definitely help. Now, using the 3 times zoom camera in low light, here I think both are actually very close. However, in this example, I think the S23 Ultra is giving you an overall sharper result. Now, in my previous camera comparison, the S22 Ultra at 3 times in low light didn't do as good, so Samsung has definitely improved this. Right, now let's look at one of my favorite areas, and that is portraits. I think both actually do an excellent job overall. Now, with both, you can use the 3 times optical zoom cameras for portraits, which I think gives you much more of a pleasing portrait. And both actually doing really well here. However, you can notice that difference in focal length even more, around 70mm versus 77mm. Colors are different. It looks like there is a bit of softening happening on my skin on the S23 Ultra. Some of you may actually like that. Now, on the iPhone, you can also do 2 times portraits, which is around 50mm, which a lot of people find more pleasing. This uses the middle part of the main sensor, so you're still getting a sharp image, and it's something that you don't have available on the S23 Ultra. Here's another example, and I'm leaning towards the S23 Ultra here because if you look at the gaps in between my arms, the S23 Ultra has managed to detect those better. However, in this example, the S23 Ultra has given me a bit of a haircut. Now, I know it can be a little bit difficult with my grays, but I think it's a great way to test out these cameras. But apart from that, I think both have actually done amazing. They've both got the parts in between my arms as well, which is very difficult to do. Now, one new feature that we had introduced on the iPhone 14 Pro Max was foreground blur in portraits. This is what a DSLR camera, for example, would do. And it looks like the S23 Ultra also has this feature, so you can see that the foreground elements have also been blurred a little bit. Now, both of these have struggled a little bit with the branches. However, I do like the iPhone 14 Pro Max foreground blur better because when it does come to editing the blur, the iPhone does blur the foreground elements more naturally. On the S23 Ultra, you've still got the same exact cutout and it just kind of blurs the middle part. It doesn't actually give you a natural foreground blur. Now, for low light portraits, here I think both are actually doing a really good job. However, the S23 Ultra has done a better cutout overall. Now, when we use the 3 times optical zoom portraits for low light, you can see on the iPhone here, it is much darker, but that's because the S23 Ultra is just zooming in to the primary camera image and it's actually not got as much of a sharp result. On the iPhone, when you use 2 times, you can see that you've got a much sharper result. So although both of these are using the primary camera, they're doing it in a different way, it seems. So for portraits, it's interesting. I did prefer the S23 Ultra in certain areas, but I prefer the iPhone 14 Pro Max in others. Right, now let's look at selfies. I actually think both take excellent selfies. In this example, I do prefer the iPhone a little bit more. I think it's maintained my skin color a little bit better. Now, you can use the wider field of view on both selfie cameras. However, the iPhone does have a slightly wider field of view, which I do like. Now in this example, I actually prefer the S23 Ultra better because it's maintained more dynamic range. So if you look at the background, the iPhone has clipped a few of those highlights. And this is a little bit more obvious when we use the wider field of view. You can see that the S23 Ultra has maintained a lot more of those colors in the background. Now we can use portrait mode from the front-facing cameras on both devices, and I think both of them do an excellent job. We've got such great cutouts here. But although the iPhone has a wider field of view for regular selfies, this option is not available when you're taking portrait selfies. On the S23 Ultra, however, you can take wider portrait selfies as well, so it does get the edge. Now for low light selfies, both of them do have a night mode for low light selfies, although it is very difficult to keep your hands still at this close distance. But in this example, I do prefer the S23 Ultra, which is giving you an overall sharper image. However, when using the front-facing flash, this is where the front screen is illuminated. I do prefer the iPhone 14 Pro Max. The S23 Ultra has kind of brightened everything too much, whereas the iPhone 14 Pro Max has maintained my skin colors a little bit better. Right, now let's move on to video. The good news is that Samsung has really concentrated on video and up their game in video as well. So when you're shooting at 4K 30 frames a second, things are very close in good light. You've got excellent dynamic range on both devices. Samsung now has HDR10 across all of the cameras, which is great to see. However, the iPhone tends to deal with the HDR format a little bit better. On the S23 Ultra, when you want to export the HDR video, it does give you an option to convert that to SDR video, standard dynamic range. So when you're watching a video like this on YouTube, then you can actually appreciate it a lot better. However, that conversion process seems to work better on the iPhone. You can see on this example here, especially from the front-facing camera, the S23 Ultra doesn't do as well as the iPhone does. Now, when it comes to low-light video, one of the things that I noticed straight away is those little light balls that people complain about a lot on iPhones are still present on the iPhone 14 Pro Max, and these were not there on the S23 Ultra, which was great. However, the more tricky low light situations I went in, I preferred the iPhone because the S23 Ultra gets very, very noisy. And this is even more obvious in this example here when I was testing out autofocus. You can see just the high level of noise that you've got on the S23 Ultra. Now, when it comes to autofocus in low light, the iPhone does have the LiDAR scanner, which makes it work really well. The S23 Ultra does seem to have been improved compared to the S22 Ultra, which did struggle focusing in low light, and autofocus in good light. It's very, very close. Right, now let's talk about 8K video. So Samsung has had 8K video on the devices for quite some time now. However, it was capped at 24 frames a second, and also it would crop in quite heavily. Now, Samsung has finally made an update to 8K video, maybe after seeing my feedback, who knows. But 8K video is now actually really, really good, and you get so much detail. Especially if you want to crop in after the fact. You can see here in the woods, you're getting so much detail compared to the 4K on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Right, now let's talk about stabilization. So Samsung has had super steady mode for quite a few years now, and it hadn't changed for quite a few years either. But of course, after Apple introduced action mode on the iPhone 14 Pro Max, Samsung had to do something, and now they have increased the resolution of super steady mode. Now, initially testing both of these out without any steady mode, just in the standard 4K video, both actually do really, really well. And the stabilization, I would say, is very close, although the Samsung can shift from side to side when it's trying to lock onto a subject. However, when you're using action mode and super steady mode, the results are really, really good and very close. Now, one thing that I noticed is whenever you switch to action mode on the iPhone or super steady mode on the S23 Ultra, it does default to the ultra wide camera, and this is what gives you the best results. However, when you do switch to the primary camera, the iPhone gives you much more stable results. So yes, we do have improvements to super steady mode on the S23 Ultra, but I would still give the edge to action mode on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Another area which seems to be a direct response to the iPhone from Samsung is portrait video, because now you can do portrait video at 4K. You saw the example at the start. You can see that here again. Now, I think both of them do a good job overall. However, neither are perfect. For video, having that cut out is quite difficult. Now, a few things that I noticed. Firstly, colors I did find better on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. You can see that the black on my hoodie is much more true to black compared to the S23 Ultra, which has more of a blue tint. The iPhone also seems to be sharper compared to the S23 Ultra. If you take a still and zoom in from this video, you can see that the text on my top of my beard is sharper on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Also on the iPhone, you can adjust the blur and edit the point of focus after the fact. You can't do this on the S23 Ultra. So again, a good attempt from Samsung to improve on the portrait video mode, but it's just not as good as cinematic mode on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Right now, from the front-facing cameras, things were very, very close. I think both have excellent dynamic range. The iPhone 14 Pro Max is slightly wider, which I do prefer, and it also seems to be a little bit sharper compared to the S23 Ultra. For stabilization from the front-facing cameras, I think both were very, very close. For slow motion, nothing has really changed much over the past few years. Now, having a look at this example at 1080p, 240 frames a second, I think both are actually doing pretty good. The Samsung does have some post-sharpening, but I do prefer it overall. Now, the Samsung also has super slow-mo at 960 frames a second. Although this is very difficult to use and it's very difficult to capture that exact moment, even with the help of the motion square. However, that option is there, which you don't have on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. So the Samsung does get the edge for slow motion. Now for audio, I'll let you guys have a listen. Now this is an audio test. You're now listening from the Samsung Galaxy S23 Ultra and now from the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Let me know which one you think sounds better. Back to the S23 Ultra and now on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. Now, to my ears, both actually sounded excellent, although the S23 Ultra does seem to have better noise cancellation. So I think this one is going to come down to personal preference. Right, that is the SuperSaf style camera comparison between the iPhone 14 Pro Max and the S23 Ultra. What are my conclusions? Well, firstly, I want to say that both of these have excellent smartphone cameras and I wouldn't have any problem using either of these as my daily drivers. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages. The S23 Ultra has that extended zoom. It also has, I would say, the better overall ultra-wide camera, but there is still that shutter lag on the S23 Ultra, which we've seen in previous Samsung devices. This is something that you don't really have a problem with on the iPhone 14 Pro Max. And although you've had big improvements in video on the S23 Ultra, in particular with dynamic range and 8K, the iPhone 14 Pro Max, I would say, still has the best video on any smartphone with that consistency across the board. Overall, better stabilization and a better cinematic mode. That's what I think anyway. What do you guys think? Do drop me a comment below. Let me know your thoughts. I always do post lots of pictures and videos on my Instagram, so if you're not following me already, you can do. I'm at SuperSaf. If you are thinking of picking up the S23 Ultra, I do have my affiliate link down in the description below, which will give you up to $150 of credit. Unfortunately, I don't have a similar link for the iPhone. And I'll leave some related videos linked here and here if you want to see more. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to see future content like this here on the channel. Hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, don't forget to smash that like button for me. Thanks for watching. This is Saf on SuperSaf TV. I'll see you next time.